Hello, this is a brief introduction to photography with a focus on composition, exposure, types of light, and workflow. Let's get started. The picture you see before you is thought to be the first photograph of human subjects. This was taken in 1826 in Paris, France, and you can see in the bottom left corner two individuals, one a shoe shiner and the other a man getting his shoes shined. This was taken in 1826. Since then, the rate of image capture has exploded. This is data from 1,000 Memories. They were able to estimate the amount of photos taken since 1826 by looking at historical sales of film, the growth of Facebook, and other inputs. And some key conclusions that they've drawn: 3.5 trillion photos have been taken since that day in Paris. 10% of those photos were taken within just the last 12 months. And we are now taking 4 times more photos than we were just 10 years ago. So rate of image capture truly exploding, and I would argue it also is exploding are the industries that are supporting our photo taking. So this is from Taylor Davidson, and it's a landscape map of the various industries that support photographers, be they professional or amateur. So a lot out there, a lot to consider, and it begs the question, where do we begin? And I would say we should focus on 4 elements. The first, composition, which I think is the most intuitive. Second, exposure, what can be the most complicated. Third is types of light, the most important element. And the fourth is workflow, which can really be the most liberating if you understand how to do it well. Let's get into composition. Composition I would define as the relationship between the camera and the subject. There are 3 components: the angle of the lens to the subject, the distance between the lens and the subject, and the position of the subject within the frame. So let's look at some examples of these. Here's an example of, with regard to the angle of the lens to the subject. This is a low angle. This is a picture I took of my daughter. We were on the beach, and literally the camera was nearly on the sand. By placing the camera so low to the ground, it really changes the relationship of the viewer and the subject, and it brings the viewer, I would argue, into the subject. I try to avoid taking pictures where I'm standing and the camera is up against my eye. I think you may not get as creative a photo as if you are moving the camera up and down. But that said, sometimes a high angle to the subject works. This is a case where that high angle, it makes the girl seem smaller. It makes her seem more adorable, and it makes the picture therefore more successful. Alternatively, had I been on the ground and I was looking up, she would look like a giant, and so it may not have worked out as well. Another consideration when shooting low angle is to shoot from the hip. When you put your camera up to your face, particularly larger cameras, it's like putting a flag in the air, and people who you don't know, when you're trying to get a candid shot, they're going to see it and they're going to begin to act differently. Shooting from the hip allows you to more stealthily take candid photos. And I actually have now put a level bubble on my camera body, so when it's on my hip, I can look at the bubble and get a good sense of the angle of the lens, so I have a better idea of whether or not I'm going to capture in the frame the subject that I hope to capture. All right, so that is angle of the lens to the subject. Now let's talk about orientations, how you orient the subject within the frame of the camera. There are a couple of standard orientations: portrait and landscape, right? So they're just 90-degree relations to each other, and you want to decide which way you go to take advantage of the subject's composition. A third, less used, but that can be quite fun, is the Dutch angle. In essence, you just turn the camera 15, 30 degrees one way or the other. Had I not done that with this picture of my daughter, she would have been vertical in the image. By putting her at an angle, it gives a sense of motion. It makes the photo seem more dynamic. The nice thing about digital photography now too, and workflow software like Lightroom, you can take a standard orientation or landscape orientation, and then when you're processing later, you can turn it around and make it a different type of orientation. So don't get hung up when you're actually composing the photo at the moment. Odds are you might be able to play with it later in the day. Another way in which you can play with your photo is how you set up the primary subject within the frame. And one thing that you might want to avoid is putting the subject square in the frame, particularly if the subject is a person. The idea is that you want to offset the subject, and a way to do that is by following the rule of thirds. So in this case, this girl, what draws the viewer in, I would argue, are her right eye, her wisp of blonde hair, and if you look at the rule of thirds, which is this grid with 4 lines, is that the most interesting aspects of the photograph fall on that left vertical red line. Rule of thirds gets a little bit more complicated when you have multiple subjects, multiple people in a frame, but it still applies. So in this case, what is grabbing the viewer's attention are her eyes and their teeth, and you can see in this case how they fall across the rule of thirds well, and what you get as a consequence is a nice balanced and interesting photograph. Lastly, consider positioning the subject deliberately to accentuate the elements of the subject. Had I put the seagull in the center of the photograph, I think it would have made the seagull seem more stationary, less interesting. By putting it in the bottom right, you have a sense of motion. So another consideration when composing your shot. And that is composition. That's the first element, the most intuitive. Let's now move to exposure, which can be the most complicated. I define it as the amount of light allowed to fall on a subject during the course of taking a photograph. There are 4 components: light, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I think that this is an important way to look at these 4 components, that they are in relationship to each other. And when you are exposing a subject, when you want to be deliberate in how you expose it, and you can expose it by focusing on one or more of these components and de-emphasizing others. And it sounds perhaps complicated, but I hope that with some examples this will be more clear. Let's look at each of these 4 components in the primary position and see what it gets us as photographers. So starting with light. Light is what's illuminating our subject. There's ambient light, the light that is available to us, the light that we walk into. And then there's also introduced light. And examples of introduced light are a flash, reflective light. You can have a reflector, or even a wall that's bouncing sunlight off of a wall. So there are different contributors to light. And when you have great light, when you have all the light you use, all the light you need, then you don't need to rely as much on the other 3 variables: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You can de-emphasize them and you can use the available light. But let's say you don't have all the light that you want. You don't have the right ambient light, and you can't introduce enough other light to optimally expose the photograph. Well, then you can lean on the other components, right? The other variables. And the first, and I think perhaps the most often used and what can really make for interesting photographs, is aperture. So aperture, you could say, is if a camera is a human, the aperture is the pupil of the eye. If you have a wide aperture, an f-stop of, let's say, 2.0 or f-stop of 4, it's gonna allow you to get a lot more light brought into the lens, and also it's going to lead to a shallower depth of field, right? So that which is in focus, that plane of focus, is more narrow. It can be tricky, but also can yield very effective photographs. At the other end of the spectrum is a narrow depth of field. So an f-stop of 18-22, you're going to get in a lot less light, so the pupil is very tight, if you will, and you're going to have long depths of field. So great for landscape, right? You want everything in focus. Here is an example of a wide aperture, so a shallow depth of field. This is a picture of my daughter, and you can see that the eyes are in focus, and everything in front of the eyes, like the tip of her nose, and clearly her ears and beyond, are out of focus. And you've got this nice blurry bokeh in the back that makes the photo seem very soft. So this was taken in the morning, suboptimal lighting, but because the f-stop, and I think it was like a f1.8, because the f-stop was so low, because the depth, because the aperture was so wide, I was able to use the available light, but also get the benefits of that narrow depth, or that shallow depth of field. Okay, this is an example of the opposite end of the spectrum. Here's a narrow aperture which lends to a long depth of field. This is a picture, this is obviously a landscape photo, and everything is in essence in focus, right? You've got the rocks in front of you in the foreground, and you've got the cliffs in the background. This was taken in the afternoon, so I had a great deal of light, and so I was able to use a narrow aperture in this case. So that's some examples of aperture. Let's move now to shutter speed. You could say that the shutter speed is like the eyelid, right? So the longer your shutter speed is open, it's able to capture more light to better expose your subject. There are some things to consider. Fast shutter speed will allow you to capture motion, freeze motion. Slow shutter speed will cause motion blur, which gives a feeling of motion. And also, if your shutter speed, if it gets below 1/125th of a second, just keep in mind that you may need stabilization, just your ability to hold the camera. You're not able to hold it steady sufficiently to avoid blur, and you may need something like a tripod or other artificial support. So here's an example of fast shutter speed. This is with a 70 to 200 zoom lens, and what you can see with this Hummingbird is that it looks as if it's just frozen in midair. So interesting. Hummingbirds are always fun to take pictures of. Here's an example of just the opposite. Slow shutter speed. The blurring is giving us a true sense of motion, and I think it makes this photo much more interesting. Otherwise, it would look, you would not recognize that he is moving the cane up and down. You might just think he's got it just stuck motionally in the air. Another fun thing to take photos of with taking the advantage of motion blur is moving water. So here's a waterfall in Pennsylvania, and you get a good sense of motion by slowing the shutter speed down. So that's shutter speed. Let's look at ISO. This is again, going back to the human, this would be like your photoreceptor cells in your brain. High ISO allows you to capture photos in low light situations. It will cause what's called noise, which are kind of like spots, flecks in the photo. The camera's sensor really matters. So oftentimes the more expensive camera, the more sophisticated camera, it allows you to go into higher ISOs and not really degrade the image quality. That said, if you find yourself with a lot of noise, with post-processing, you can play a lot of that noise out. So definitely a lot of flexibility still with us with regard to ISO. And if you can, try not to go beyond 1,000 ISO. I mean, maybe 2,000. It really depends on your camera. Between 100 and 1,000, you're not going to see that noise, and you're not going to see any limitations to your photos as it relates to ISO. So here are some examples, or here is an example of high ISO. This was actually ISO of 5,000, and also it had an aperture of 1.8, so pretty wide open aperture, and also pretty slow shutter speed, 1/125. So playing a lot of the elements to their extremes, and I was able therefore to take a picture in a very low light situation. So that is composition. Now let's move on to the third, types of light, probably the most important. There are different types of light to consider. There's front, which I think can be boring. Overhead, which is bad in that it's going to cast shadows down, particularly on faces, which does not show well. There's what's called side or Rembrandt light, which adds depth to the subject. There's backlight, which adds an additional type of depth, but it can be very difficult to pull off. Diffuse light, light that comes through trees or light that comes through clouds, can be magical, but also I would say a tragic miss. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there is the golden hour, just as the sun is coming up in the morning and just as the sun is coming down at night. That is a great time to take photographs. So here's an example of frontal light. You can see how it is, I would argue, boring, not a lot of interesting elements being highlighted in this photo. Here's an example of side light. This was done with an off-camera flash, and you can see how it illuminates the cheeks and the nose in a very flattering way. Here is an example of diffuse light. This is actually coming through a single pane leaded glass window. You can see how the shadows are coming onto my daughter's face as the light goes through that old 1926 window. Here are a couple examples of reflective ambient light. So the primary light source was a window to the right in the case of the first photo, the photo on the left. There's a window on the right of her. That window was also casting a light, or the light was hitting the wall to the left of her, a white wall, and it was reflecting off that white wall. So she actually had light primarily coming on the right side, but also coming on the left side. The next photo here is same daughter, and there's a reflective panel on the ground, and so the light is coming up. You can see in her eyes the catch light. You can see how the catch light is on the bottom of her eyes. That indicates where the light's coming from, and it gave a very, very nice photo, I believe. Here's a picture of backlighting, and it was actually backlighting that was done during that golden hour. So it really highlights my daughter's hair and the warm feeling when you look at this photo. The way in which the grass is illuminated points that out. So just some considerations. When would you use your on-camera flash? If you have an on-camera flash, the camera flash that pops up when you're in suboptimal lighting situations. I would argue when you're documenting insurance claims, so when your basement floods, when you're taking a passport or DMV photo, and when you're spotting a Yeti or a UFO or anything that everybody believes does not exist. You don't really care about the quality. You just need to capture the image. In fact, that's the takeaway. If you don't care about the photo's quality, use your on-camera flash. And of course, I'm being facetious here. You really want to avoid it because it's not a great way to illuminate your subject. Try to use an open aperture, slow down your shutter speed, increase your ISO, and if you are able to, if you have a speed light, get it off the camera, put it to the side, or seek out another light source. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is workflow. This is the fourth one. And it's really important because if you do workflow right, you're going to really liberate yourself from what could become a very tedious and monotonous experience, and that's keeping and processing your photos. So the first thing to consider is whether you keep or you delete your photo. One of the problems with digital photography and big memory cards and shutter buttons that you can just hold down and take hundreds of photos with is that you end up having thousands and thousands of pictures. And it's important when you are downloading your photos to look at them critically and clearly. Anything that's out of focus, and if you don't want that picture out of focus, delete it. Be disciplined. Delete. Keep only the best, and then dedicate yourself to optimizing those best, right? So by that I mean crop it, crop it so you've got that rule of thirds. Tilt it if you want the Dutch angle. And also consider filters. There are a lot of filters available, particularly through software like Lightroom. You can take a color photo, you can make it black and white, you can make it look aged. I believe I've got some pictures of that. Yeah, so here is an example of why cropping is important to consider. This is neither standard nor landscape nor Dutch. This is square, and I think it makes the photo more fun, right? So in this case, she's in the middle. That was deliberate, but to some extent, she's also off to the side. And then here are some more examples of filters. You can see how it gives a feeling, it adds an emotive component to the photo. The nice thing about filters, they're oftentimes non-destructive. So what that means is you can take your photo and you can just flip filters through the photo, or I should say flip the photo through the filters and look at them and see whether or not they're giving you the effect that you would like. And then lastly, a final closing comment. This is a photo of my daughter and me. You can see my feet down there on the bottom. Make sure that that's not the only photo of you. If you are out there always taking pictures of others, At the end of the day, or in 10 years from now, as people are hopefully looking at these pictures, there will be none of you. So find a way to turn the camera around, take pictures of yourself, and also help others that are around you to get as excited around photography as you are and get them as proficient, if not more. So thanks. I hope you enjoyed this, and good photo taking.